a lot of dystopian novels, but you might be surprised to know that I've never actually read 1984 before. I've been very aware of it for a long time, and I found when I read it this time that there were a lot of things that seemed very, very familiar. But as far as reading it cover to cover, or reading it at all aside from very short excerpts, this was the first time. I did find that because it is such a definitive work of dystopian literature, and it has at least in part served as the inspiration for many other dystopian novels, and just the way that it has kind of permeated our popular culture, there were a lot of things that were very familiar. Expressions like 2 + 2 = 5, we were always at war with East Asia, or Big Brother is watching you, that was all very familiar. And because of those, I could kind of infer, and I kind of knew just from reading about it, what some of the main things going on in this particular dystopian society were. But, of course, reading it all through and getting to know the characters and seeing the plot as it unfolds, that's a completely different experience from just absorbing it through popular culture and its influence on other literature. So, what does the dystopian society of 1984 look like? The main character lives in a futuristic version of London. I say futuristic, but it's actually not really futuristic at all. Both because the technology and whatnot that exists in that world is very comparable to or even less advanced than our own, and because it actually takes place in a world that was the future at the time, but is no longer the future, is actually the past. It takes place in the year 1984, which, it being published in the 1940s, that was the future. But now it's 2022 and that's in the past. Dystopian literature is futuristic by its very nature, but in this case, this is a mid-20th century view of the future, not a present-day 2020s view of the future. In thinking about what makes this particular society dystopian, I mean, it's very surface-level obvious that it's a dystopia. This is not one of those like The Giver, where it seems very perfect at first glance, but then you dig a little bit deeper and it gets to be kind of disturbing. This is just a dystopia that nobody in their right mind would ever want to live in. And while some of the characters do seem to think that it's a good place to live, it's very, very obvious to the reader that that is not the case. But as far as the specifics of what make it dystopian and how that kind of society is maintained, I came up with 5 specific things that I noticed about it. Number 1 is censorship and control of information. In the world of 1984, basically, you don't know what information is true or not, and whatever you're told is what you're meant to believe. And that even goes to the extent of actually modifying historical records and modifying the past, because the characters, they don't believe that the past is fixed. They change their opinions on it all the time, not based on new evidence, but just because what they've been told has changed. So the main character remembers that they were at war with East Asia and then Eurasia and now East Asia again. But the official line is we were always at war with East Asia, and that's what most people wholeheartedly believe. Because, hey, all of the newspaper records say we were always at war with East Asia, and the party says we were always at war with East Asia, and so of course we were. Of course we weren't at war with Eurasia, just a few weeks ago. One of the techniques used to control information and people's thoughts even is Newspeak, which is an entirely new dialect of English. It's a new language being created, basically, using English vocabulary and grammar, but drastically limiting the number of words available, so that in some ways, thoughts that go against what you're meant to believe or what your opinions are meant to be, those thoughts can't even really be expressed. Or words have meaning taken away from them so that, for instance, equal means the same size or the same weight or the same monetary value or whatever, but it doesn't mean equal status under the law, for instance. Eventually, Newspeak is supposed to completely replace Old Speak, in other words, modern English, as both the official language and the language commonly used among the people of the society. However, they still speak Old Speak in the year 1984, and the appendix actually implies that Newspeak never becomes the actual language being used. One thing that I want to address is that language does change naturally over time. The English that we speak now is not the same English that was spoken by Shakespeare, much less in the Middle Ages or even earlier. But language usually evolves naturally based on a variety of factors, and usually it expands in terms of the amount of vocabulary rather than having the amount of vocabulary reduced. Words eventually do fall out of usage, like for instance, we no longer say thee and thou, but that's because they've been replaced by something else, not because that concept has been prohibited. What's happening in 1984 is essentially modifying language unnaturally in a very prescriptive way in an attempt to censor people's thoughts. So it's very different from just the natural evolution of language, the fact that we no longer really use whom or shall or thee and thou or whatever anymore. The second way that the world of 1984 is dystopian is a concept known as doublethink. Doublethink basically means you know something is a lie, but you believe it anyway. And it's something that the people in this society are very, very good at. And it's something that they basically have to be good at because of the whole constantly changing information about the past kind of thing. If you knew that you were at war with one country, and then all of a sudden the information you were given is that you had always been allies with that country, and you've always been at war with a different one, you couldn't possibly believe that unless you were using something like doublethink to both know that it's a lie and yet 100% wholeheartedly believe it at the same time. I think that the government of this country in 1984 actually does this unnecessarily in order to make people never be sure of what's true or not. There's an example that I wanted to show you that kind of proves that, I think. The main character's job is actually updating historical records so that they reflect the current truth rather than the historical truth. And this is how he kind of explains what his job is to himself and, by extension, to the reader. But actually, he thought, as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's figures, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense for another. Most of the material that you were dealing with had no connection with anything in the real world, not even the kind of connection that contained a direct lie. Statistics were just as much a fantasy in their original versions as in their rectified version. A great deal of the time you were expected to make them up out of your head. For example, the Ministry of Plenty's forecast had estimated the output of boots for the quarter at 145 million pairs. The actual output was given at 62 millions. Winston, however, in rewriting the forecast, marked the figure down to 57 millions so as to allow for the usual claim that the quota had been overfulfilled. In any case, 62 millions was no nearer to the truth than 57 millions, or than 145 millions. Very likely no boots had been produced at all. Likelier still, nobody knew how many boots had been produced, much less cared. All one knew was that every quarter astronomical numbers of boots were produced on paper, while perhaps half the population of Oceania went barefoot. And so it was with every class of recorded fact, great or small. Everything faded away into a shadow world in which finally even the date of the year had become uncertain. So basically what I'm getting at there is if all the numbers are made up, why not just make the original estimate lower than the eventual number in the first place? I was at first kind of thrown off by this, but when I gave it some thought, I figured if people are able to accept changes in the number of boots that were predicted to be made, maybe that makes it easier for them to accept that we were always at war with East Asia, or that 2 + 2 = 5. It's not just about doublethink or control of information, though. The population is also under very, very strict surveillance. They all have a telescreen in their homes, and the telescreen watches them. They watch it, it watches them. So, like for instance, it can speak to you. It can tell you it's time to do your morning exercise, or it can tell you you're being apprehended by the thought police. The idea that your screens are watching you, of course, isn't actually new to any 21st century reader, but it's interesting that that was predicted all the way back in the 1940s. And the extent to which that surveillance is used to terrify people is just really kind of disturbing. Like, just your facial expressions when you're watching an announcement on the telescreen, or what you murmur in your sleep, could get you disappeared in the middle of the night. As if that wasn't enough, the fourth thing that I noticed is that they turn people against each other. What I mean by that is kind of twofold. On a class-based level, there's the inner party, the outer party, and the proles, short for proletariat. And they are all kind of not necessarily strictly against each other, but they're clearly not, they don't have a lot of affection or respect for each other. The party views the proles as not even really being human, and the inner party has a lot of advantages over the outer party, and there's no camaraderie between the people in this world. But then, on a personal level, you also can't trust your friends, your coworkers, even your spouse and children. Anybody could be working for the thought police and could turn you in, even for something that you weren't aware you were doing. Like one of the main character's coworkers gets turned into the thought police by his very young daughter over something that she heard him murmuring in his sleep. Another character disappears because he's too intelligent and understands too well what the Newspeak project they're working on is meant to do, the way that it's meant to control people's thoughts. And that's not even getting into who the main character trusts that he shouldn't, because I'm not going to spoil that. Closely related to that is brainwashing from a very young age. Now, the main character was actually a child during the revolution, and he kind of vaguely remembers a time before. But one thing he observes is that children growing up in the year 1984 are blindly loyal to the party and have no problem whatsoever turning on their parents if they find that their parents have even the slightest bit of thought crime going on. These children, when they are elementary school aged, they join a program called the Spies. It's never really said why it's called that, but I think it's fairly obvious. They're meant to spy on their families and the people that they're around all the time. They're meant to report them, and that's exactly what they end up doing. Even the character Julia, who is an adult but about 10 years younger than the main character and doesn't remember a time before the revolution, she has a very different outlook than him. She is equally, if not more so, rebellious than he is, but she's only concerned with things that impact her personally. She doesn't have any concern with the greater issues of, like, morality or what one might describe as politics or philosophical issues. All she's concerned about is the ways in which her life is controlled and restricted. Whereas Winston, the main character, he's very interested in trying to piece together the real history and trying to understand why things are done the way that they are and thinking about if things might eventually be able to be changed, which I think is probably because he does remember very, very vaguely. But still, he remembers a time before things were like this, whereas she doesn't. I often talk in these Catching Up on the Classics videos about things that you might find surprising about the book, and that's actually one of the things that I think you might find really surprising in a lot of young adult dystopian novels in particular, but even in some that are not specifically young adult. The new generation, the young people, are kind of portrayed as the hope for the future. Even in, say, Fahrenheit 451, the character Clarice is portrayed that way. She's a young teenage girl, and she thinks differently from a lot of people around her. Certainly in something like Divergent or The Hunger Games or The Giver, where the main character is either a child or a teenager, that's often how it's portrayed, that the young people can see a vision for a better world or are going to finally stand up, whereas the older generations have failed to. That is not at all how it is in 1984. Winston speculates that hope might actually lie in the impoverished lower classes. They're not watched as closely and they're not quite as indoctrinated. No one really cares what they're thinking as long as they do what they're told. And so he suspects that if change is going to happen, they might be the ones to initiate it. It's definitely not in the teenagers or the children. They are beyond brainwashed. But there is also very little hope whatsoever. This is a very bleak dystopian society that's not really a good place for anybody. It's not like it's terrible for most people, but it works for an elite few, like, for instance, the citizens of the Capitol in the Hunger Games. It's not like it's a world that everybody thinks is perfect, but really, below the surface, it's not like, say, The Giver, for instance, or maybe Brave New World. It's a society that is just terrible for everybody. 85% of the population are just living in poverty and have absolutely no rights and are not even really viewed as human beings. Another, about 13%, are like middle class, but a version of middle class that is so bereft of anything that makes that desirable. What it amounts to is barely having enough to get by and not really being able to take any pleasure in life and being very, very strictly watched by those just above them who are worried that they might be a threat to them. Even for the members of the inner party, though. I mean, they have more comfort and luxury than anybody else in the society, but they also are subject to the doublethink kind of thinking and never being aware of what's true or not and being very closely watched. And I don't think it's ever implied that they wouldn't also be disappeared in the middle of the night if they ended up being guilty of thought crime. And Big Brother, who runs the whole thing, is implied to not exist at all. So there's really no one benefiting from this that, wouldn't probably be better off if it wasn't like this. So I don't really understand why they want this kind of society, except I do, because Orwell goes into great detail about why it was established. And actually, that's something else you might be really surprised by. Orwell actually criticizes both capitalism and communism really harshly in the section where he explains how the society was created, what Orwell actually describes as an alternative. Now, granted, this isn't a book that exists in this world with all of the potential distortions of the truth and whatnot that come from being a book that exists within this world. But what the book that the main character is reading suggests is that if society hadn't gone this route, it would have gone an almost kind of Star Trek-like route where wealth doesn't really mean anything anymore because while some may have a little bit more or a little bit less, everyone has more than enough. And political power also doesn't mean as much anymore because without the inequalities of wealth, everybody has pretty much equal power as well. And from what I understand, Orwell actually was like a democratic socialist or something like that. So, that probably was pretty much in line with what he believed. I think it's really interesting to see it written from that point of view. I mean, obviously, that was his vision of a couple of different potential futures from the mid-20th century based on, things that were going on in the world at that time. Not necessarily what people would come up with in the modern day, but it is just a really interesting kind of perspective to look at the whole situation from. And then finally, one more thing that might surprise you is that the two main characters are not good people. They really are not. I found it really hard to empathize both with Winston and with Julia. They're certainly more sympathetic than other characters in the book, but at the same time, they really are not good people. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but I think this isn't too big of a one. They get recruited into this kind of resistance movement called the Brotherhood, and the guy who's talking to them about it, he asks them a bunch of questions about what they would or wouldn't be willing to do, and they say they would do anything. And he really pushes them on what anything means. And that includes things that would result in civilian casualties and assassinations and things like that. So yeah, they definitely are willing to go to pretty extreme lengths, although they don't ever actually end up doing those things. And that's just one example, but there are plenty. I think that's how it would be though, probably, because the society that they live in is just so messed up. And people don't really have any concept of what it means to care for another person or to want to do the right thing. And so even these characters that realize that things are wrong, first of all, they're more concerned with how they can, be together because their relationship is forbidden. And then secondly, how they can do things that will enable them to get away with their thought crimes and to be slightly better off just for themselves. And then there's, joining the Brotherhood and trying to kind of fight back, but trying to do the right thing or make society better. It's something that Winston thinks about in kind of abstract terms, but it's certainly a low priority. And they live in a society where children report their parents to the thought police, and you really can't trust your friends or the people that, the people that you love. The idea of love even is kind of viewed with suspicion and not really seen as a good thing. So I think that them being kind of unpleasant people actually works really well. It just makes it a little bit harder to read. Overall, I wouldn't say that I enjoyed 1984, but I would say that I thought that it was very interesting and very thought-provoking. And it's not the kind of book that one really enjoys. It's not fast-paced, doesn't have likable characters, doesn't have the kind of setting that you would want to read for, escapism. It's the kind of book that you read because you want to be challenged and you want to think about difficult questions, complex topics. And I think as far as that goes, it does really well. And I definitely would recommend it, both if you like the dystopian genre and also in general, because I think that there is a lot of good food for thought in it.